This is part 3 of the lesson, and as promised, it's going to be an analysis, but it's going to have to be a fairly quick, cursory overview analysis of the essay because of time. We only have about 10 minutes per video on YouTube, so I'm just going to hit the high points of what I talked about in the lesson so you can sort of see how these elements are used in an actual narrative essay. So, just some context for those of you that may be unfamiliar with who Zora Neale Hurston is and what's going on here. She was a very famous African American, Black American writer in the early 20th century. She still is very famous. She's still taught in numerous schools and numerous English classes. She was a member, sometimes closely associated with, sometimes not so closely, of a group of writers called the Harlem Renaissance. This also includes Langston Hughes, if you're familiar with him, the poet, among other people. I believe Paul Dunbar was also a member of that. They were very prominent Black American authors in the 1920s and early 30s who spoke about the Black experience within America during that time. So there's some terms that are used in this that have fallen out of favor, things like colored or Negro, that some of you may find offensive, but you need to understand the context at the time that colored referred to any minority who was in minority was the concept of anybody who was not of European descent. And then Negro was a term used for Black Americans rooted in the Latin word, which is also the word that we get for Niger and Nigeria in Africa, the countries, which literally means black. Of course, that evolved to the racial epithet that we find very offensive unless we're hip hop artists. So, again, that gives you a little bit of background on some of the language here. So, let's talk about setting. That's the first element we talk about in the video, right? So the first thing we talk about is setting. And if you look at the essay, I'm going to type the word setting here. What's unique about this essay is there's multiple settings, and you can just sort of skim it quickly and see a few settings. The first one is a specific town. Notice how she uses specificity here. So we have Eatonville, Florida, right? That's a setting that she discusses, and she goes into detail what that looks like in a way here, which is what I talked about. She uses terms like proscenium box for her front porch, which is a reference to the theater if you're unfamiliar with that. So she tries to use comparisons to make it uh, more available to her readers. And then she talks about Jacksonville, Florida, where she was sent to school and what that was like, and how in that time she became more aware of her blackness, of her difference at that time. And then she goes on further, talking about what that meant to her in that time. We go on further to Barnard, which, if you don't know, is a university, right? And notice that she's naming each of these places specifically in this. And then she talks about the basement that is the New World Cabaret, which was a jazz club in Harlem, right? So, yeah, we have multiple settings here, but throughout each of these, if you go back and read this closely, I want you to pay attention to how she uses descriptive language, but she doesn't go over the top. I mean, this thing is only a few pages long, right? She doesn't go over the top, but there's sensory details. It puts us in a specific time and place. We can visualize what she is doing there and what's going on with the setting. And remember the importance of time and place, the setting. Okay, obviously, the next thing we really talked about was character, and we know that Hurston is the protagonist. And the protagonist, we need to determine what the protagonist wants here. What does she want? So as you are reading this, I want you to think, what does she want? What is her end goal here? Because that is what drives the narrative. It is also what will reveal the implied thesis, the message, the lesson that you're supposed to get from reading this, from the experience of reading this. Now, it seems pretty obvious that what she's trying to do is define herself against the idea of what it means to be colored in the US at that specific time in history. But that may not be all of it. And one of the things I want you to think about is, what does she learn about that state of being, right? Because really, does she learn something? What does it mean to be colored in the US in the 1920s, right? I mean, what does it mean now, for example? How does that differ from other ethnicities' experiences? Okay, so now that leads us to plot. Remember, plot is created from the protagonist desiring something, there being an obstacle toward them achieving that desire, and that creates the different beats, scenes, moments, episodes in the story that lead toward the realization, and it also creates the conflict. So, looking at the essay, I mean, it's pretty obvious. We start with her being young in Eatansville. Then we move on. The next step is move to Jacksonville, where her difference finally starts to become apparent to her. She goes to Barnard University, where she suddenly does feel very different from those around her. And then she talks about the New World Cabaret, right? And her white friend who's sitting at the table, and how that makes her feel more black, right? The juxtaposition between her and her friend increases her blackness, right? So, what we want to think about is how she actually uses each of these settings as a place for an event, a beat in the plot that reveals the conflict and reveals the implied theme, right? So, all of these things are very intertwined, right? And that is probably the last thing I'm going to leave you with, because we have about a minute and a half left, is this idea that setting, plot, and character are all intertwined. You notice that I made the same notes for plot as I made for setting, because the plot is built around each of these places that she lives and the events that occur, like watching the whites who are going to Orlando, who drive through her predominantly African American town, right? And then moving to Jacksonville to go to school, where she suddenly is the little colored girl, right? And then Barnard University, where she is surrounded by white intellectuals and white middle class people who really emphasize her difference, coming from a more poor background in Florida. Not just her difference of being colored, but her difference of being in the South. And then this New World Cabaret, where this is a jazz club, which jazz is a music rooted in Black American culture, but it's consumed by whites. And the whites at this time, people of European descent, didn't really understand the roots of jazz being in Africa. And she really explicitly expresses this in her experience of the music versus her white friend's experience of the music. Okay, so read, read, read.